Hello, I'm Sonya Nevin. In this talk, we'll look at the imaginary world of some of the most famous novelists, the Brontes. The adult Bronte sisters are known for their novels set in England and Belgium, but we're going further back to look at their Juvenilia, the work they wrote as children and teens. It's a really special opportunity to look at work of this sort. We can see in young people's writing a sort of apprenticeship for their later work, and it's interesting in its own right as a window into a young person's perception of the world they're coming to know better. What they have seen, heard, read, and imagined is poured into that early writing. In the case of the Brontes, particularly Charlotte and her brother Branwell, we see a mix of what they have been learning about classical antiquity and what they've been reading and learning about Africa. These two phenomena are combined in imaginative and creative ways. In 1826, when Charlotte Brontë was 10, Branwell received a set of toy soldiers. The toys inspired an outpouring of creativity in which the soldiers were the star performers. The children began to write stories, plays, histories, and magazines based on an imaginary world created for the soldiers. They were set in an imaginary society in Africa. The toy soldiers were known as the Twelves. In the history of their fictional universe, the Twelves had settled West Africa above the Bay of Guinea. They established territories known collectively as the Glasstown Federation, with a capital, Glasstown, at the mouth of the Niger River. We can see a map of it drawn by Branwell, and here it is in a more diagrammatic form by Bronte scholar Christine Alexander. And here for reference is a modern map of the same region. The Glasstown Federation covered from around Guinea and Sierra Leone east towards Nigeria and Cameroon. Several years into writing about this world, a new kingdom called Angria was established. Angria covered much of Cameroon, and that's where most of the action was focused from then on. The accounts of the adventures set there are generally known as the Glasstown and Angria saga. The French have also settled part of this region. There are Bedouin Arab traders there, and there are West African inhabitants. Although in reality, this is an area rich in different communities, in the Bronte Juvenilia, this complexity is simplified so that almost all Black Africans are represented as belonging to the Ashanti people, a real West African community, but one that is nonetheless misrepresented in this homogenizing process. After an initial peaceful period of settlement, there is frequent war between the Glasstown Federation and shifting alliances of Ashanti, French, and Bedouin. The classical world is a key part of how this imaginary society works. Not least, the children imagine themselves as the genie gods of the land, modeling their divinity on ancient polytheistic gods and, as the genie title indicates, on characters from 1001 Arabian Nights and from James Ridley's Tales of the Genie. They would be the gods, the creators who decided the fates of their creatures. Branwell, in particular, evoked Zeus in his genie persona, giving himself the genie name Branny Lightning, riffing on the connection between his surname, Bronte, and the Greek word Bronte, meaning thunder. Where did this interest in and knowledge of West Africa come from? The region had long held significance for the family. The children's father, Patrick Bronte, had been a student at St. John's College, Cambridge, which had been the epicenter of the abolitionist movement campaigning to end slavery. It was there that William Wilberforce became involved, and it was there that the Nigerian abolitionist writer Alauda Equiano inspired so many. Once the slave trade was officially ended, many of those involved in abolition campaigning turned to missionary work in West Africa, and the Bronte children's father was involved in training and supporting people who would travel there. The Bronte children knew all of this, and it fed into their interest in the area. The Bronte children were educated largely at home, although the girls did spend time at school. At home, one of the most important influences on their perception of Africa was Goldsmith's Grammar of General Geography for the use of schools and young persons. From this, they learned a rough sense of the geography of the region and the names of many of the places within it. These were duly incorporated into their Glasstown writing, so we find mention of places such as Kumasi, Dahomey, Benin, Calabar, and more. And at the edge of the Federation is Jibal Cymru, the Mountains of the Moon, based on a real mountain range. The family were also avid readers of Blackwood's Edinburgh magazine, which carried a great many stories about contemporary events in Africa, particularly about the Ashanti War of the 1820s. So the children were aware of genuine projects of colonization and missionary work. They were aware of genuine competition between British and French interests, and they knew of the Ashanti people, even if they wrote other communities out of the picture. The children made an effort to make their Africa feel African. Although Europeans are the main characters, there are Black African characters, and they are included in the stories. The inhabitants are described as tall, strong, well-made, and of a black and copper colour, typically very handsome with fine eyes. Exploration by early arrivals reveals the landscape to be, quote, luxuriant but uncultivated. Interestingly, however, the same landscape can be described as barren wilderness when things go less well for the same characters. Above all, there is repeat use of the term burning throughout the saga. That's used to describe details such as the burning hot pavement of the town or the burning sands of the desert, but more often it refers directly to the heat of the sun. There was a real need to rely on this sense of the burning African sun, because in some ways, the Brontë teens were rather unsure about the landscape. References to the natural environment frequently sound far more like the Northern European environment that they were familiar with, rather than Cameroon or Nigeria. As our mythical childhood colleagues from Cameroon have told us, Cameroon can be regarded as Africa in miniature, so varied is its landscape and people. Yet the oaks, weeping willows, flowering meadows, heath, moor, and so on that we hear of in the Juvenilia have their inspiration in Yorkshire. We can see this to some extent reflected in the saga's illustrations. Here we see a character called Mary Percy, Duchess of Zamorna. She is in an estate at the northern edge of the Glasstown Federation. Yet we can see that its natural environment in which she stands is not imagined to be so very different from a drawing by Charlotte of her school. One important distinction is the inclusion of a mountain in the background, known to the Brontes from accounts of West Africa. The desert is often described as barren, although there are occasional references to groves of palm trees which save those caught in the sands. Where does the classical world fit in all of this? The young Brontes were learning about antiquity as part of their education, and we see the classical world throughout the saga as the young writers gained more and more confidence about incorporating this knowledge into their work. They were creative in how they incorporated it, yet they were also influenced by what they saw of adult writers using references to antiquity in novels, poetry, and in the essays and speeches that they read in magazines and journals. For one thing, we gain insight into characters by hearing what degree of classical education they've had. We know that Zenobia Elrington is unusual and well-educated, for example, as she is the only female character who knows enough Greek to read for pleasure and to teach some of the young men of her circle. Characters are also described with reference to the classical world, whether they are beautiful Hebes or, like the main character, Arthur, a fabulous Apollo. And the classical world is fundamental to the creation of a colonial environment. The Brontes had read about the establishment and development of European colonies all over the world, and they imitate that in their imagined society in Africa. We find several instances of the classicizing of the African environment. The main river, for example, is not as we know it, the Niger River, it is the Olympia River. Other areas of the landscape are similarly classicized. The valley in which wealthy members of society build their homes, for example, is known as the Olympian Valley. This associates the physical environment with an aspect of the classical world, and it implies an application of the same ideas to society. These are the best people, as Olympians are better than mortals. We see it again in the way that Europeans describe the African environment. New arrival Edward Sidney regards West Africa as an earthly paradise, with a splendid city rising with such graceful haughtiness out of the green realm of Neptune. This is telling us about Edward and how he sees the world, but it's also an insight into this classical interpretation of landscape and environment. It's a possessive instinct, in a way, making something unfamiliar less unknown by likening it to something fantastic yet familiar. We see this further in how Edward thinks about his decision to come to Africa. We hear of the necessary stimulus as the distant and, to an Englishman, almost utopian colony lately founded in Africa, which was rising like a new Albion under a brighter sky and sunnier climate. Here, Britain's ancient name is invoked to express the idea of starting afresh, a utopian Britain begun again with better weather. Other characters repeat this idea of a utopia with further references to the classical. There had been an idea, prominent since at least the 18th century, that cultural vitality moves from one society to another teleologically. The Brontes had clearly been influenced by this concept, and we see it repeated in the mouths of the central protagonists. In a speech given at the first Angrian Parliament, for example, Arthur presents his interpretation of historical development in which Angrian society is the inheritor of the vitality that made ancient culture great. Cultural vitality, he says, has passed from ancient Egypt to Assyria, to the Jews, to Persia, to Athens and Sparta and Macedon, to Rome, and then to the wild Goths, Mecca, the Tartars, to modern Europe and America, and finally onto his lands in the imaginary African realm of Angria. Africa is the inheritor of ancient excellence. More than anything, the classical world is evoked in the built environment of the Glasstown Federation. We see this even in the name of the greatest city. Initially, the Great Glasstown, it becomes Variopolis, and then the easier to pronounce Verdopolis, as the Brontes learn more about the classical world and their own. In case any imaginary reader should miss the significance of this change, Charles, one of the narrators of the saga, explains that the new name is a compound of a Greek and French word combined to create the same meaning as the original name. The classicizing of the name reflects the increasing classicizing of the environment. These children have read about colonial environments. They know how important neoclassical architecture was to the colonial ventures in India, the Americas, and elsewhere. And they have their characters replicate this in the settling of West Africa. Verdopolis is increasingly described in neoclassical terms. It is a city of columns, stowers, and classical temple-style buildings. We see this even more in Arthur's new city. He becomes king of Angria, and then eventually restyles himself as Emperor Adrian the Magnificent. He builds a new capital for Angria, naming it Adrianopolis after himself, in the style of many a Greek or Roman leader. In the two cities, we find districts named after the Muses, a city gate known as the Gate of Hades. We find a secret gentlemen's club named Elysium, named after the home of the blessed dead in Greek mythology. This club imitates something the Brontes had read about in Blackwoods. Similarly, the atmosphere of a high-class gambling den is conveyed through description of its neoclassical architecture. The walls are entirely built of highly polished grey marble, as was the roof, supported by fluted pillars of the same, crowned with Corinthian capitals. The description of classical features creates an impression of elitism with additional connotations of luxury and perhaps decadence. Classical architecture is a sign of the Europeanization of the environment, of technical skill, but not always of moral goodness. This idea can be seen to go further, so that taste in classical architecture or art can illuminate a person's character. Early on in the saga, Charlotte described Arthur's private apartment in a way that indicates his interest in the classical world. In addition to the rich Persian carpet and arabesque ceiling, there, on the Parian mantelpiece, stood a number of images classically designed and well executed in Japan, China. Parian marble, the marble used for much ancient and 18th century sculpture, and classical images are combined with carpets, precious stones, and perfumes to create an atmosphere of genteel comfort. The decor indicates Arthur's wealth, but also his taste for the exotic, the elite, and the beautiful. When Arthur's father visits, he criticizes the room's luxuriance and its suggestion of sensuality. Arthur's brother Charles contradicts him insisting that Arthur is not spoiled by the luxury, only drawn to objects out of intellectual curiosity and good taste. Neoclassical styling occupies an ambiguous position, poised between positively perceived elite high culture and negatively perceived elite decadence. This ambiguity reflects tensions within Arthur's own character, which is naturally great, but is prone to the bad as to the good. In a work written 4 years later, Charlotte's references to neoclassical architecture express the extent to which Arthur's tendency towards luxury has triumphed over his youthful self-restraint since his adoption of the crown. Arthur's increased despotism manifests in his preference for Corinthian classical style with gorgeous capitals, and his rejection of the more restrained Doric style found in his former home. His brother Charles had been happy enough with the classical Doric stowers of old Vidopolis and thought the best of Arthur's taste for classical art. But he sees in the Corinthian columns of Adrianopolis a sign of his brother's despotism. Narrating, he draws an explicit contrast between Arthur's luxurious new palace in Adrianopolis, styled, as he puts it, after Ionia in her loftiest times, and the simpler, classic elegance of his former home. He observes bitterly that the sterner, more imperial style of the new palace shows how well the lord of both has changed and risen. Charlotte's distinction between different styles of architecture suggests that she was familiar enough with the Greco-Roman world to recognize differences and attribute meaning to them. For her, Greco-Roman culture was not homogeneous, but a complex range of phenomena whose differences could be employed to convey meaning. Overall, however, the use of classical architecture is represented as a fundamental part of a colonial venture, used to reframe the environment. The inhabitants of the Glasstown Federation are shown to incorporate even Africa itself into a classical framework. In the Grove of Tears on Philosopher's Island stands a mausoleum, a black marble monument surmounted by a gracefully sculptured personification of Africa weeping under her palm tree. We learn that this monument commemorates a long past grief. It turns out to be the tomb of the King of the Twelves, slain in battle during the first wave of settlement. There is something at odds in depicting Africa mourning the man who led the invasion, yet it is entirely in keeping with the classicizing instinct that we find throughout the saga. The young Brontes were learning about the world and learning about the classical world. In their rich Juvenilia, we can see how they creatively projected what they were learning into a new society. Their work reveals their growing awareness of how classical antiquity reflects contemporary aspects of social class and moral character, and how it can operate as a form of colonialization and transformation, reforming one environment in the imagined image of another. As Charlotte Brontë entered adulthood, she was conscious that she was stunting her progression by writing about the same characters in an environment that she didn't actually know. All the same, there is something wistful about her final juvenile work, A Farewell to Angria. In it, she refers to the distinctive feature of her imagined yet real land, the sun, saying, "I long to quit for a while that burning clime where we have sojourned too long." With that, she left her imagined Africa. From now on, Charlotte Bronte's fiction would be set in environments that she knew well. Yet ultimately, Charlotte carried many of these early ideas and techniques into her adult writing, and classical culture would remain an important aspect of her technique and inspiration. You can read more about the Brontë Juvenilia in the Our Mythical Childhood Survey of Antiquity in Children's and Young Adults Culture, and in the material listed here. Thank you.